This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge at Wharton.
While the science of climate change is pretty clear, the issues have been so politicized here in the U.S., and there are so many Americans who say they don't believe that it's real or that it is man-made. Now, new research from here at the University of Pennsylvania shows that people's opinion on the issue could depend on how questions are being phrased. According to the report, some trivial decisions made when constructing questions can, in some cases, alter the proportion of the American public who believe in human-caused climate change. The report is titled An Experimental Examination of Measured Disparities in Public Climate Change Beliefs, which was just published in the journal Climatic Change. Joining us is one of the authors of the report, Matthew Motta, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. And also joining me in studio, Eric Orts, director of the Initiative for Global Environmental Leadership, who is also a professor of legal studies and business ethics. Matt, great to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Eric, great to have you.
Good to be here.
So I guess give us a sense how you got into this frame of mind of looking at the phrasing and the presentation of this information being brought forward. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So as anybody who's worked with this type of data, public opinion about climate change now knows, the public has been polled about climate change for 20, 25 years. And when you actually look at the survey results and how different firms have asked these questions, there's not a ton of standardization. Sometimes you get standardization within a particular firm asking the same question over time, but a lot of firms differ in the way that they ask those questions. Typically, they differ in pretty subtle ways. But when you actually look at public opinion about climate change, you sometimes find some very different effects. So, for example, there was a op-ed published in the New York Times a few months ago suggesting that most Americans and even more than half of Republicans believe that human-caused climate change is real. But benchmarks from Pew, the Pew Research Center, suggested that number was a fraction of that, only about 25% of Republicans believing in human-caused climate change. And so that kind of inspired us to study how these seemingly minor differences in the ways the questions were asked and administered might impact what we think the public believes about climate change.
Eric, I think this is to a degree a story that we see in various forms, various sectors across the United States over the course of time, in that how something is presented to people really can have an impact on their belief on either side of a particular topic.
Yeah, it's really important research to get into the question of how do people form these beliefs, and then what do you really mean when you are quoting these different kinds of studies. So I think it's really important research. It seems that overall we see an increasing, and maybe Matt can confirm or disconfirm this, but we see an increasing number of people, at least in the last few years, increasing numbers who are both believing the science of climate change, that is, that there is global warming and that's having climatic, that is, extreme weather events of different kinds, and that's human caused. So one of the difficulties in this kind of issue, though, is that it's somewhat complex. So it's not really and it's subject to a lot of political fighting, as is well known. Yeah. So people are getting lots of different messages, and it's not that easy even for experts to explain and understand. And the science itself is moving to some extent. So there are different estimates of what the risks are that come up over time, and there are different reports about, okay, scientists have connected this big weather event to an increased probability based on climate change. So that's one of the difficulties here, is that it's a rather complex topic. But that overall, though, I would say that it's important to recognize that there's an increasing confidence that people are expressing that climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, and it's important what you call it, is happening, and that it is human caused through primarily through greenhouse gas emissions.
So climate change is one side, I think, to this story. Do you think that this is also just kind of a more pervasive viewpoint on science in general these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that public confidence in the scientific community, for example, while it's been relatively positive on both the ideological left and right, has been declining on the ideological right. And so to see that public opinion about climate change has ticked upward slightly, I think, is an encouraging sign.
Right.
But to Eric's point about observing change over time, our research underscores the need for standardization across public opinion polls. Because if we want to be able to observe change in opinion over time, let's say the number of people who believe that climate change is anthropogenic or human caused, it's very important, we argue, that you ask those questions in the same way. Otherwise, you can't be sure whether the changes you observe over time are due to changes in the way the questions were asked or due to actual changes in opinion, especially in response to particular events.
And I ask that in part because when you think about other areas of research and that areas that scientists would be involved in, you think about research around cancer. I think we have a general belief that the research that is done around cancer is pretty straightforward and it is believable. So there's an issue of topic, I think, that also plays a role here.
Yeah, for sure. And the same points that we make in our piece, I think, can be applied to so many other aspects of how we understand public opinion about science broadly. It's important to ask people questions regularly and in the same way in order to be able to study how, let's say, a new drug, a new type of treatment comes out, hits the market. How does the public respond? Standardization, I think, is key there.
Eric?
Yeah, well, I think one important issue that comes out of this, too, is that there's a way in which you can ask questions that approaches science in a more or less respectful way.
Sure.
So you can ask a question where scientists have said X. Do you believe the scientists who say X? Or you can just ask an open-ended question, which means people are just going to maybe look at the most recent information that they had, whether it's a tweet or some other kind of news item or something like that.
Right.
So I think that that's one thing that comes out in these studies as well as in general, it seems to be that most Americans are actually pretty scientifically literate, and so they can understand the questions that they're asked.
Right.
But if you're just kind of giving open-ended questions and leaving it open as to what the scientific background is, then it can significantly affect the answer that people will give.
But you mentioned in your paper, Matt, that the area of focus, or at least maybe one area of focus, does involve the education process, especially as kids are coming up through the school systems of understanding the value and the importance and the veracity of various elements of research.
Yeah, absolutely. How people think about the questions they're being asked in surveys depends on the knowledge they've got from previous life experiences, from previous educational experiences. And if people are educated in different ways, if they have different life experiences, which of course we all do, we are going to interpret seemingly minor, seemingly trivial things in different ways. And I am thinking now specifically of research showing that the public thinks about the two terms, climate change and global warming, in very different ways.
Right.
Even though we might use them interchangeably on occasion, those words can have different meanings to different people, with the term global warming being associated more with ideological liberalism and particular causes on the ideological left. That term brings up a different set of considerations for conservatives.
Eric brought up social media a second ago. So how much do you think we also have the impact of the various social media platforms and having tweets and messages kind of being bombarded at people on a moment-by-moment basis?
Absolutely. So it's not necessarily the case that a huge fraction of the American public is paying attention to climate-related social media at any given time. But those tweets that get picked up into news stories, that get talked about in the popular press, that sets the term of debate to some degree. And so you risk kind of a compounding effect, I think. And that's something we absolutely have to be aware of.
So Matt mentions having somewhat of a standard moving forward. I guess, how do we get to that standard in society these days when we have so much back and forth, Eric, on a variety? I mean, climate change obviously is one thing, but there's so much back and forth on so many topics these days.
Well, and I think it's difficult to come to a standardized way to ask the question, although I think it's really important, as Matt is indicating, that we get some indications of how to do that. But As indicated, Matt's point about climate change versus global warming, I mean, a scientist is not going to make any distinction whatsoever about that. They have a complex view of the issue. Climate change is caused by sort of an average temperature increase, but that doesn't mean that you don't have other kinds of extreme weather events like a polar vortex moving in its course. So a scientist will understand the complexity of that term. But everyday people who are not immersed in the science and are not really following the issue that closely, they're going to be they're going to be subject to different kinds of political manipulations of the term and otherwise. So just to say, one argument that's been given is that even climate change, which has now been kind of banned by the administration in certain agencies, some people have said, well, that's actually a little bit too mild. Climate change seems like, well, it's changing, but couldn't be changing in both directions. We don't really know. It's kind of like a nice, easy word. So David Orr of Oberlin College, who's coming in for a conference here at the School of Design this week, has said, well, we really should use the term climate disruption. Another way to think about this is that there's virtually universal acceptance of the fact that climate change and actually some former national security people and generals, et cetera, just came out with a letter about this. There's really no in the military, in the national intelligence communities, there's pretty much an acceptance of the view that the science is real in terms of creating a threat for us. So then another term that people have used, and I think some of the political candidates are now using it, is climate security, that this is really a threat to our national security. So if you ask a question, do you believe in climate security, that's going to trigger a different response entirely to people, right? So if you ask them that question, as opposed to do you believe in global warming, climate security is going to trigger for people wildfires that have occurred and recently, flooding, hurricanes, et cetera. You're going to say, okay, I actually care about national security, and if all the generals and intelligence people are saying this is a national security issue, then it's going to be more likely that more Americans are going to say, I care about that. When you say global warming, as Matt said, they're going to associate it to wasn't that Al Gore or whatever, and they're going to they're going to have a political answer to the question.
But even the use, Eric mentioned the term disruption. Yeah. And you think about the use of the word disruption in today's society. We think about how businesses are being disrupted. We talk about how technology is being disrupted. Yeah. And for the most part, we have come to the point, I think, where maybe the term disruption had a bit of a negative connotation a few years ago, but I think it is now more mainstream and more accepted than it was a few years ago. Absolutely.
And those types of decisions are exactly what we set out to study in our study, and those are the kind of things we need to be cognizant of going forward. In our study, we were able to look at 8 commonly used question formats, but there are, as Eric mentioned, potentially hundreds, thousands of ways to ask this question. Yeah. And although there's no perfect way to do it, and although our research can't conclude that one way is better than another, having one standard that we kind of commit to and say this is the way that we want to ask it for the foreseeable future, I think is very useful.
Coming from the scientists, more so. Right?
Yeah, well, we could, for example, peg the way we ask the question to the way that scientists themselves are talking about the issue. Right. We could do something like what The Guardian is doing right now, changing and standardizing the language that they use in newspaper articles about climate change. And another aspect of this issue that we haven't talked about as much is the signal that these polls send to policymakers. Right. Lawmakers in Washington and at the local level are, to some degree, attentive to public opinion. And if we're asking the public different questions about a lot of different topics, say climate security versus climate change versus global warming, policymakers might not know how to interpret that and what to do. And so that's just, another, part of the case for standardization.
Eric?
Yeah, well, I think that's right, and I think that one of the implications of these studies is, first of all, we should be careful not to put too much weight on these polls. I think that's one takeaway that I would have of reading these. Yeah. I think in general there's been a sense where polling one way or the other is relied on very heavily. Yeah. People actually change their behavior on the basis of the poll that gets published in the New York Times or whatever. Right. And then I think what we're seeing here is that we really have to be careful about that. We really have to make judgments based on informed understandings about the science of a particular problem, and then and then go from there, more than kind of shooting from just, the XYZ's up in the polls, let's go for that person or this person. So I think in general, it encourages us to get to be a little more careful. At the same time, I think these studies are really important because it matters whether people care about, whether you want to call it climate security, climate change, whatever, is really important, because if they don't care, that means we're probably not going to have public policy decisions, or businesses are going to feel less pressure to make the right choices with respect to climate change. So it is important to get an accurate read. But I think what this study and it really is good at showing is that we can't over-rely on a particular poll. You really have to have a sophisticated view of what is polling doing, what are the questions you're asking, and be very careful, as this study does, about the biases that are going to just get implicitly included in there whenever it's a politically charged issue.
And we are also now, because of the numerous times we've talked with you, Eric, about the issue of climate change, we are now at a transformative period on this topic to begin with. And not only do we have to look at the now, but we have to look at what the future is going to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years, not only about the science and what is actually occurring, but the data and the questions themselves as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And another place to look for listeners to look and follow the information on where actually is the public on this issue is the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication, and they've done some studies that I think confirms this general view that Americans' opinions are changing, and my guess is that the Americans' views are changing because you're starting to see the actual impacts, and scientists are also confirming this. You have to be careful of when some extreme weather event actually is climate change induced or not, but I think Americans are coming to get that it's not normal to have the kind of firestorms that you have in the West, and it is connected to increased average global temperatures, that you're having droughts, that you're having extreme storms, that you're having extreme heat waves. So we just saw in India, one of the worst heat waves ever is hitting India, where you're hitting 123 degrees Fahrenheit, and people are dying from that. So I think people are looking at that evidence, and they're starting to move. So as I indicated earlier, I think most Americans kind of understand science is important, right? And so as you increasingly have this evidence building up, their views are shifting. So just an example, if in a recent Yale study, a majority of Americans are worried about extreme heat of 61%, flooding 61%, drought 58%, and then water shortage a little bit less, 51%. But that probably indicates, around here we have a lot of water in the Northeast, and people are not so worried about that, but they're worried about flooding or increased severity of hurricanes. So I think that's you are seeing a shift, and that's why whether or not you're having a shift really matters fairly significantly with respect to whether you have public policy changes or not.
Do you expect that we will see a change in mindset on the types of questions that will be asked and how they will be asked in these various polls as we move forward?
Yeah, my co-authors and I really do hope that there will be more standardization in the future for precisely some of the reasons that Eric just mentioned. If we want to see how the public responds to, say, an extreme weather event, we need to know what they believed before it and what they believed after it. And if what was asked before it is somewhat different than what was asked after it, then we don't necessarily know that the event caused that change. Right. And so we're really looking to standardization as a way to potentially capture the impact of those events. From studying the literature on the impact of the physical environment, say natural disasters like hurricanes and floods, on public opinion, the effects are pretty varied. I think we can all agree that there is some impact, that those disasters do move public direction in a pro-climate change direction. But the size, the magnitude, and how quickly that happens, we don't necessarily know for sure what that is. And our hope, and my hope, is that increased standardization will allow us to study this more systematically.
Is there a little bit of almost a relearning about giving questions at this point?
Absolutely.
Because I think in many of these polls, the path that has been taken over the last 50 years, 60 years, whatever that number is, has been basically the same.
Right.
So you're talking about needing to have almost a formative shift in how we move forward here.
Absolutely. Very minor changes in the way you ask a question. For example, if you give people response options that are what we would call a Likert scale, an agree-disagree scale for anybody who's ever taken a poll or a survey, versus if you give people specific positions. I think that climate change is happening. I do not think that climate change is human-caused and happening. That decision can move opinion, as we show in the paper, pretty significantly, and it can be the difference between whether or not it looks like half of, let's say, self-identified Republicans appear to believe in human-caused climate change, or whether that number is just a quarter. And that difference matters a lot, not just for how we understand public opinion, but for the messages that policymakers and others and, the news and the press take from those polls.
Minor changes, but potentially with major impact.
Absolutely. And I do hope that this calls on the survey community and the polling community to double down on standardization. There have been efforts in the past, of course, but we're still kind of all over the place.
Right. What's then? Is there a next logical step for you as a follow-up on this work that you've done?
So, as Eric mentioned, this is actually really interesting. We have been polling the climate security question, and I don't have those data available yet, but I wouldn't be unsurprised if we didn't find what you were expecting to find, that maybe these questions do resonate more with people who care about the military and national security, for example. But I think another thing that we really need to do is to start, administering the same questions over time and looking at how public opinion changes when you use one format versus another, which are more responsive, for example, to the physical environment. But we also need to look at more of these subtle changes that exist between firms. Like I said, we looked at 8 different ways that the question is typically asked, and we think we got some of the most common, but there are potentially hundreds of different ways you can ask this question. And so we'd like to see more effort to study this in an even bigger way.
Eric?
Yeah, just to give one example, maybe for the listeners to kind of get the importance of how you describe the problem. If you ask someone, are you in favor of a death tax? They're generally going to say, that sounds terrible, death tax.
Yeah.
Or if you ask someone, well, are you in favor of inheritance tax? Then they'll maybe think for a second and say, actually, I'm not going to have any inheritance. Those are, they kind of put it together.
Yeah.
Well, mostly this is really rich people giving,
Absolutely.
So I think that's an example of how important it is to get the phrasing right, and why studies like the ones that Annenberg is doing are really important, because you want to try. Ideally, I think you probably want a relatively neutral or objective question, but it's really hard to get that. So maybe climate change is actually in the neutral space. Right. But it's it's kind of that's the difficulty is, and one way around that is you start to ask questions that are maybe a little bit more specific about the problem, that are not sort of using the label that someone's going to kind of trigger out.
But I would say that as we start to shift questions towards, let's say, climate change effects, even things that appear objective can be interpreted in very different ways. So we know that the public, for example, thinks about 90% employment and 10% unemployment in different ways from research in behavioral economics. And so if we start telling folks, you live in an area where there's a 75% chance you're going to experience this type of disaster, well, people are going to interpret that number differently. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And one of the best things I think we can do as survey researchers is to say who interprets generally particular numbers in different ways, particular words in different ways, and then account for that when we look at public opinion to then say, look, this poll produced this number, but keep in mind the question was asked in this way.
Right. And I think it's not only are you talking about having an impact on the asking of the questions surrounding a lot of these topics, but when you think about how our culture, our society is in general, branding, marketing firms, that's their bread and butter. They ask questions in a specific way on a particular product to be able to get the right answer. So you're talking about not only something that could have an impact in science, but potentially in other areas as well.
Absolutely. I think this is a very generalizable phenomenon because it speaks more to human psychology than it does to any particular survey. People take different considerations with them when they take a survey online or when they take it on the phone.
Yeah.
And the more we know about those people and the more we know about why they believe what they believe, the better we're going to be at assessing public opinion accurately.
Eric, final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I guess the final thought is that I think it's important then for the public, and you mentioned social media earlier, there's a lot of bad effects that social media is having, and one of them is that everybody is listening to everyone else as an expert. And so I think one thing that this variation in polling and opinion indicates is that there really is a need for people who are in positions of authority to be making decisions, and that includes not only politicians but members of the armed forces and the national security establishment. And I think it's clear that they are not being driven by polls for the most part. There's an attempt, you might have a politicization of the process. Recently, the National Security Council is recently proposing to have an adversarial approach to thinking about whether climate change is real or not. And then about 58 senior military and national security leaders pushed back and said, no, from a bipartisan basis, we really have to follow the science. And the science says, to quote them, climate change is real. It is happening now. It is driven by humans, and it is accelerating. And when generals and admirals and top CIA people say that, they are not basing it on polls or politics. They're basing it on the science that they're that they're relying on in order to have contingency plans and
what
to
they
develop
see
our
firsthand,
national security forces to protect the country and to protect people that are going to be affected by this. So I think that's a key. Is really let's follow the science and not public opinion when it comes to doing the right thing.
Great having you here. Thanks, Eric. Nice meeting you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best. Matthew Motta, postdoctoral fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center. By the way, again, if you would like to read the article, which is titled An Experimental Examination of Measurement Disparities in Public Climate Change Beliefs, it was published recently in the journal Climatic Change. You can check it out in that publication at your first opportunity.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.